Can we stop conversations? Okay, order, order. Richard Bergen to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bax. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'm delighted to have secured this debate. I'm also delighted to see such a packed Westminster Hall. And I want to start off by thanking all the parents and all the campaigners who rightly put this issue high on the agenda, all the organisations who have provided briefings for MPs, and of course all the MPs here in a packed Westminster Hall. Now, nearly 50 MPs have put in to speak today, and I can't recall anything like that for many other Westminster Hall debates, and so I hope both the government and all those with a say over the parliamentary agenda take note and ensure time for a much longer debate on this vital issue very soon. Because this is an essential debate. The crisis in send provision is one of the biggest messes left by the previous government, one that the new Labour government will have to start to clear up quickly, as send needs are only likely to increase. That will require, I would argue, a radically different approach to the one that's currently failing so many children. We can't have this debate today without acknowledging how this crisis is deepened by an austerity agenda that has torn up much of the social fabric that once would have offered pupils and their families much of the support needed. That dangerous idea has hollowed out councils' budgets and severely restricted the services they can provide. It's caused long-term harm to the NHS, including huge waiting lists for assessments and massive backlogs in mental health services. It's placed unbearable pressure on schools who are asked to do more and more with fewer and fewer staff and resources. It's caused key public workers to leave due to stress from simply impossible workloads and low pay, further weakening services. I will give way.
Thank you. Thank you for giving way, and also for congratulations in securing such an important debate and for such a full Westminster Hall. Since 2010, schools have been grappling with the chronic underinvestment by former Conservative governments, and we know that special educational needs and with those with disabilities have borne the brunt of this, and schools are expected to pick up the pieces without the proper support to do so. So does the member agree with me that we need to build capacity and expertise within the mainstream system so that more children can access the universal and targeted support that they need?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. She puts it very well, and I couldn't agree more. That's exactly the case. And there's an old saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, so many of the key services that we had in our communities to help support child development are on their knees due to austerity, and children are paying the price. Now, every MP in this House is aware that the special educational needs and disabilities system has gone beyond crisis and is in emergency. I will give way.
Firstly, can I congratulate you on the debate? You'll remember we had one in the main chamber as well, like this one, record demand. That tells the government something. Does he agree that one, of course he's right, there's not enough money for SEND generally, but two, it's also distributed very badly. I mean, in my constituency, we get £900 per child from the central government versus, let's say, Camden, £3,500. That means we have delays of 2, 3, 4 years, EHCPs not delivered, places not delivered, therapy not delivered, and if we don't solve both, we won't solve any.
I very much agree with the right honourable gentleman who is making the point, amongst other points, that this is a holistic issue. Unless we solve all the interconnected root causes of this SEND crisis, then we will never solve the crisis at all. And we've all had so many heartbreaking constituency cases. And for this debate, I asked on social media for people to send in their case studies. And I was inundated with cases from right across the country. Now, I won't be able to cite them all today, but I've read them all, and they form the basis of what I will say today. This crisis, I will give way.
Suggested by the turnout today, Mr. Chairman, that this debate could go well held in the Chamber, and it should be at least 3 hours. Can I just commend the honourable gentleman in bringing this forward? I support him, and obviously the Minister doesn't have to respond for Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland send pupils numbers some 20% of the school population, and the budget that we spend in Northern Ireland is in excess of 500 million per year. It doesn't anywhere meet the demand. So does the honourable gentleman agree that what we need is more placements, more teachers, more places in school as well, and ultimately better funding, because we can't leave behind the SEND children that we all represent in this chamber?
The honourable gentleman puts it very well indeed. And this crisis is the result of many factors that others will no doubt give more detail on in today's debate. But at its core is the mishandling, I would argue, of the 2014 Children and Families Act. Those aims were laudable: the widening of access to SEND support and the promoting of a more integrated approach involving health, education and social care. But the reality has proven otherwise. Since 2014, the number of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities has increased to 1.7 million pupils. That's 1 in 6 pupils, and I will give way.
Thank you. I congratulate my honourable member for bringing this debate forward. As well as more money, better use of money is also key. We've seen a huge reduction in the amount of money being spent in primary schools for speech and language therapy, which then costs the system far more in secondary school, as well as, of course, having worse outcomes for children across our country. Does he agree?
I certainly agree with my honourable friend, because early intervention is so important, both in giving adequate and timely support to young people, but also in the long run in keeping the costs down, because without early intervention, the problems that children face can only get worse and worse. And the numbers needing more support through an education, health and care plan has more than doubled. But the required resources, as others have indicated, have simply not followed. I will give way.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I thank him for this debate here today, which is so important and has filled my inbox over the last many, many months, and I'm sure it has for other honourable members here today. The honourable member mentions the eligibility that changed in 2014 with the Children and Families Act, and it added an extra 11 years to the amount of children that could be, and young people that could be included in this. Does he agree with me that it was a complete failure of subsequent governments not to put the extra resources in that matched that additional amount of years, and that has led to a perverse system where we now see local authorities battling with parents using not just barristers but also King's counsels, so sure of their righteousness in their battle with parents that they are having to battle parents who often are not represented legally and have to represent themselves, but they're using barristers and KCs. Does he agree with me that is perverse and should never have happened?
I thank my honourable friend, and that's a very important point, and I certainly agree, and I'll turn later on in my speech to the subject of the tribunals. And when we look at the statistics on the outcome of those tribunal hearings, I think that underlines her point very strongly indeed. I'll make a bit of progress if that's okay, and if others wish to seek to intervene, I'll take some interventions again later before the end of my speech. Greater need and inadequate funding is a recipe for disaster, and the disaster, I'm afraid, is exactly what's happened. In my 10 minutes, I can't touch on every example of this crisis. I will give way, and then I'll make some progress.
Thanks very much for giving way, and congratulations on bringing this really important issue to this chamber. Does my honourable friend agree with me that despite the huge increase in EHCPs, that the investment in both mainstream schools and special educational needs schools is being drastically cut in the past? And it's having a huge impact mainly on mainstream schools who are trying to backfill the provision for special educational needs pupils in our area. Listen, a society is often measured by the way...
Please, sorry, interventions have to be brief. We've got a lot of people down to speak, so please keep interventions brief. Richard Bergen.
My honourable friend makes his point well. he makes it passionately, and he's exactly correct. And that's what parents have been saying to me, and also what people who work in our schools have been saying to me as well. So I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. And I want to highlight now some of the most appalling statistics. Over half of SEND pupils have been forced to take time out of school due to a lack of proper provision. Some children are missing years of schooling. 2 in 3 special schools are at or over capacity, with 4,000 more pupils on roll than the reported capacity. There are eye-watering delays for children to get their education, health and care assessments and plans. Less than half of these plans are issued within the 20-week legal limit. Nearly a third of parents whose children have special needs have had to resort to the legal system to get them the support they need, and have spent thousands of pounds in many cases to do so. 7 out of 8 teachers say that SEND resources are insufficient to meet the needs of our children, as do 99% of school leaders, according to NEU and NAHT staff surveys. And councils face huge SEND deficits, now at £3.2 billion, but expected to reach £5 billion by 2026. The core £10,000 that special needs schools receive on a per-pupil basis has been frozen since 2013, despite spiralling inflation, costing them hundreds of millions of pounds last year alone. I could go on and on and on, but that alone is a damning indictment of the system. Child neglect is defined as the persistent failure to meet a child's basic physical and or psychological needs, likely to result in a serious impairment of the child's health or development. That is what this failure is, and we should be deeply angry that children are being neglected like this. This SEND crisis is part of the wider crisis in education. Too few teaching assistants, too few educational psychologists, too few special school places, the closure of Sure Starts. All that and more means schools are unable to provide the support they need for children. It means effective early interventions are not possible. And when that happens, the children's needs can deepen, and they then need more costly support. And when schools face such difficulties, talk of bringing more children in mainstream schools rather than specialist provision is just empty rhetoric. All this is exacerbated by national curriculum changes and a much more rigid, prescriptive focus to learning and greater emphasis on performance measures that simply don't provide the flexibility needed for genuinely inclusive education. So it should be clear that we can't solve this crisis by looking at the SEND system in isolation. We have to consider the wider education system as a whole, and I will give way.
I note that he mentions the staffing crisis in the SEND system, and I would like to note that there is also a crisis in recruitment and training for teachers of the deaf, a real key role for a number of deaf children, particularly in my constituency and from my own experience as well. And there is a real crisis in backfilling these positions and recruiting across councils, particularly at a unitary level, when the amount of need for teachers of the deaf is not reflected in those coming through the system, and it results in quite often children not having the resource they need and not having the help they need to succeed in school.
I thank my honourable friend, and that's exactly correct. I'm delighted that my honourable friend has put on record the specific contribution of teachers of the deaf and the situation that's faced in relation to recruitment of them. The current situation is working for no one, not for children, not for parents, not for teachers, not for children without SEN, and not for local authorities. The last government's approach has pitted parents against local authorities, while the government failed to take responsibility. It has created a completely adversarial system with ever more cases going to tribunal. 14,000 last year alone. That's up fourfold since 2014. Parents win in 98% of these cases. 98% of these cases lead to the parents winning. It's exhausting and often traumatic for them, as well as a complete waste of money. And even then, the right support often doesn't follow, at times due to local authorities being cut to the bone and the lack of effective mechanisms they have to hold schools to account, especially since academisation. Now, of course, that's only the tip of the iceberg, as so many parents simply do not have the time, the energy or the money to undertake such legal action. The government has a duty to end this blame game by addressing the root causes of the crisis, the failed policies that got us here. And as I draw to a close, I just want to make a point about increasing attempts to shift the blame to parents. With stories blaming so-called pushy parents, a former minister accusing parents of abusing the SEND Tribunals scheme, and other powerful people calling for parents to make fewer demands. I will give way.
Thank you very much to my honourable friend for giving way. He mentioned the statistic that 98% of parents who've made that appeal are then successful. Does he therefore share my concern that this suggests parents who should be supported are instead encountering a system that layers uncertainty and stress on an already difficult and stressful situation? I think on the Wirral you don't need to see inspection results to know that parents feel failed and feel let down. And does he believe that we need to do more to support and challenge councils to ensure that is a better system for parents and their children who in a time of need are too often, they feel, met with rejection and failure?
My honourable friend makes that point very well on behalf of his constituents in the Wirral, and I completely agree. What a trauma. Trauma piled upon trauma to force parents through this adversarial system after all they're going through, struggling just to get the best for their children, because the best is what our children need and deserve. And I suspect this blame game in relation to unfairly calling parents pushy parents was all part of a strategy by some in the last government to blame the system breakdown on too much demand for special education provision and claim that this demand must somehow be suppressed rather than being met. And I fear those who promoted this could even have been looking to water down legal entitlements of children with education, health and care plans. As I'm sure it will, our new government needs to ensure that this demonising of parents is challenged. So to conclude, Mr Betts, this dire picture I've painted today is not inevitable. This system can be fixed. Children can get the education that they need and deserve. It requires improvements in the SEND training for teachers and SENCOs having proper time to focus on doing their job. It requires many more support staff in school, which means proper pay. It requires changes to the curriculum and the way our education system is so focused on tests and league tables that there is a pressure to off-roll SEND pupils. It requires genuine early intervention, including the restoration of Sure Start. It requires the scrapping of the safety valve scheme and requires writing off of local authority debts. And of course, it requires cash. And I note the F40 group believes the high needs block alone requires an additional £4.6 billion a year just to prevent the crisis from getting worse. I know that so many honourable members want to speak today. I'm delighted that the new Education Secretary has recognised that there's a crisis in SEND provision, because the first step for solving a crisis is to recognise that there's a crisis. And I hope that this exercise today, which has gone into this debate, will continue in this debate and will follow from this debate, can be part of getting a grip and turning the page of a situation where so many children in our society aren't getting the support and education they deserve in order to fulfil their potential of a happy life, which is something all our children deserve.
Here, 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 here. Consider SEND provision. Obviously, we've got a lot of members want to get in. We've got 40 minutes. I'm going to impose a time limit of 3 minutes. Please don't take more than one intervention, because that lengthens the time. Interventions should be to the point. They shouldn't be speeches. If you make an intervention, you won't get called to speak as well. Right. Off we go. Dr. Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Today. May I also thank the Honourable Member for Leeds East for tabling this important debate. I wish to place on record my gratitude to all the teachers in my constituency for the work they do, and in particular, in the spirit of this debate, the teachers and staff at Hazel Oak and Reynolds Cross, the two maintained special schools within Solihull West and Shirley. But I particularly want to single out the parents of those children with special educational needs, who often strive so incredibly hard to achieve the best for their child. In January 2022, there were 2,023 Solihull residents with an EHCP. That was a 16.1% increase on the year before.
Honourable friend give way.
I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Despite legislation requiring a final education, health and care plan to be in place within 20 weeks of an initial assessment, Cheshire West and Chester Council are achieving just 6.5% within that time period. That's fewer than 1 in 15 children. Too many children in my constituency are being let down by the Cheshire Labour Councils. So I want to highlight the work of the Cheshire West and Chester Send Accountability Group for bringing families together on this issue. Does my honourable friend agree that a more efficient EHCP system is crucial in delivering for Send children and their parents?
My honourable friend is entirely right. The delays in EHCP assessments are a hindrance on a child's access to the national curriculum. We are failing them by not having those assessments done in a timely manner, and we need to improve upon that. So I agree with her comments entirely. Now, I have a constituent who has come to tell me that the nearest school with all the facilities for her son is 31 miles away. That means she and her child have had to settle for a school which is not fully equipped for his needs, simply due to geography. As so many members will also encounter, my constituency surgery is regularly visited by parents with similar cases. Evidently, the current system is not working. So in this speech, I wish to propose 3 changes, I believe, that will lead to a significant improvement for schools and families affected by SEND provision. Firstly, is something that everybody in this room is already leading in, and that's raising awareness of the issue of SEND. And it is heartening to see so many members who are engaged on this topic. It's only by doing so and educating ourselves and others that we can hope to make a change for the better. Secondly, there is identifying those children with special educational needs at an early age, which is vital to maximise their life chances. That is why I would like to see better training and resources providing to teachers to help with earlier detection. I won't give way purely because of the time to get through, if I may. Aside from one's family members, children spend most of their developing life with their teachers. It's important that the teaching curriculum is sufficiently flexible to enable children to reach their true potential. I'd also like to make a special reference to those military families whose children suffer from special educational needs. And having served in the military myself, I know of several families who have encountered these adverse effects as a result. With regular school moves, often between different local authorities, there is an inevitable need to reapply for an EHCP, and thereby delaying access for the provision that is so desperately needed. Now, my final request for the Minister comes as no surprise. To achieve all of those 2 improvements, it's important that local authorities receive the funding they need. And in particular, I ask the Minister that my own council of Solihull receive their fair share of funding, because presently Solihull Council take and send children from Birmingham, but receive much less funding per pupil, and that matter needs to be rectified. So I believe those 3 things, awareness, training and funding, will make a real, tangible impact on young people, their families and their life chances. Thank you.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Betts. It's a pleasure to serve under you in the chair. What a mess. Young people broken by a broken system. The Children and Families Act promised so much, but without people, money and the rest of the system to back it up, it could never deliver. And when the wait is over for the diagnosis, the battle won for the EHCP, masses of resources spent, demand is still not met, staff do their very best, but still people falling out the system. I've spent the last year digging really deep, looking at the local, the national and the international to bring best practice into this space, looking at the environment, the community and the child. The environment, I say to the Minister, go back to the department and rip up the behaviourist approach to education. It creates a world where neurodiverse children, those with anxiety, mental health and even the timid cannot survive. Instead, adopt a therapeutic nurturing approach for all children to thrive. In York, where schools have all gain, recognising the needs that every child will be safe, valued and included. Because it's a happy place where a child will strive for excellence and the whole child will be able to navigate their way through this world, not the obstacle course of micro-traumas, stress and anxiety. And let's not build bigger and bigger schools, but more therapeutic and intimate spaces which belong to the children where they can thrive. And instead, bringing those children out of homeschooling, out of their bedrooms and off the streets, back into the classroom. School must be safe for all of these children. But also, we need to recognise, as the government does, the failed nature of the curriculum. Let us build space for our brains and our bodies. And are we really shocked that young people are failing when only half of them is engaged? We've cut out arts, music, sports, nature, dance, play, exploration, wonder and fun. Yet all children, especially those with SEND, really benefit from the balance that is needed. When I visited Sweden, I went into schools to hear what they were doing. And they brought people into the heart of the school, not prescribing from an EHCP, but instead taking a whole child approach and a whole school approach, using the skills of psychologists, teachers, OTs, physios and speech therapists for all children. So let's recognise that school community and ensure that we value them too. Our TAs do so much of the work and yet their pay is so poor. It must be addressed. I'm going to continue. And as for parents, I've seen parents pushed away and gaslit when instead they should be integrated at the heart of the school, as they do in Sweden, leading on what their child needs. And when it comes on to the children themselves, let us review the purpose of education, preparing children for the world today. Instead of breaking and testing them, those children with SEND really do struggle in that environment, just to satisfy data for governments and different goals. We need every child to flourish, and that is why we need to think again.
Downage.
To serve under your stewardship, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Leeds East for securing this debate in the time permitted to me. I suppose the best place to start is the beginning, and for a child who needs targeted, tailored support, early identification can make the world of difference, because the impact of failure to spot a child with additional needs can be severe and far-reaching. Early identification means life-saving, life-altering adaptations in the way teachers interact and communicate, the way children are supported, reducing the need for EHCPs and one-to-one support, and improving academic outcomes, life chances, and well-being and happiness, which is obviously crucial. But spotting children with SEND, particularly autistic children and especially girls, autistic girls, can be very difficult, and there is not sufficient training for teachers to do that at the moment. There are around 200,000 autistic children in England. The majority of them are in mainstream education, but the National Autistic Society report that staggeringly only a quarter of autistic children feel happy at school. And that's why some parents take the drastic step of paying for private education that they can ill afford, because they need education that addresses their children's need. The effect of this on a neurodivergent child in the wrong education setting can be devastating. The Guardian reported in March that already 20,000 autistic children are persistently absent from school. Ambitious About Autism reported that of those, 4 in 5 report mental health issues. Now, I have a suggestion for the Minister, because 3/4 of parents, according to the National Autistic Society, said that their child's school place didn't meet their needs, and teachers do a remarkable job, but they need to be equipped with the very best tools and advice so that they can give their pupils the very best possible chance of learning in a happy, safe and well cared for environment. But currently only 1 in 7 school teachers have received any form of autism training, and 70% of children say school would be better if teachers understood them. So there aren't enough SEND school places, but as a health and care minister, I started work on introducing the Oliver McGowan mandatory training for health and care staff. The minister will know about this. It equips health and care professionals with the skills and knowledge and understanding of autistic people and those with learning disabilities. It's delivered by autistic people and people with learning disabilities, people experts by experience. They get paid to do it. It's really effective. 84% of participants say they feel more confident in their work, and today it was nominated, shortlisted for an NHS Parliamentary Award. So I'm asking the Minister if she would meet with Paula McGowan and look at whether this could assist teachers, using that training in an educational setting to help teaching professionals would be able to improve the way that teachers are able to support autistic children and those with learning disabilities.
Member for Leeds East for securing this extremely vital and important debate. As a former teacher, everything I've heard today I've witnessed and I've seen, and I won't need to repeat that. But I will want to take on 3 points in the time that I have. And that is the first one. In my city, like others, we've had a 30% increase in our EHCP plans, and somebody also mentioned around the extension of the 11 years. Those kids at 16 just drop off. What happens to them? How do we support them? So that's one of the issues. The HCP increase has led to one of my constituents' childs waiting 40 weeks for their EHCP plan to be turned around, which has left them with no secondary school place, and we're already in the first week of term because of the complex issues. My ask is that we actually should be putting these children a year earlier to selecting their secondary school places so that they have time to transition, to meet with staff, to grow their awareness of the school community and to be engaged in that community. So as a teacher before this, coming into this role, I always look at solutions. So that's one of them. The other solutions are what we need to do as a government is utilise the funding raised from ending the tax break from private schools to evidence-based early speech and language support in our primary schools. We must make sure that Ofsted's new report card has inclusion as part of the report so we can see what our schools are doing. We must make sure that teacher training, entitlements, an annual CPD for all staff in education is around SEND, and mental health support should be increased, but not just increased, but records kept properly so that they follow the pupils when they move on to their next phase of life, whether that's education or into the workplace if we're really going to look at EHCPs. And finally, I think that a school in my area, it is called the Trafalgar School, is a fully restorative practice school, and we need to look at using innovative projects like that around the country so that those children have inclusive education and it is inclusive for them as well as a person. Thank you.
And I also want to thank the member for Leeds East for securing this important debate. And I know time is tight, so I will keep to a couple of very specific points. One such specific point is on the government's plans to add VAT to private schools and how this will affect SEND provision. So my first question for the Minister: what impact assessment did the government carry out with regard to the VAT changes to private schools on children with special educational needs and on SEND school places? If the government have done an impact assessment, will they publish it? And if they did not, why on earth did they do that? Right? I appreciate the Minister might not be able to answer that question here and now, but I see the officials are there behind her, so I'm happy for that to be sent on to me. Now, as I understand it, the government policy is not to impose VAT on private school places where the school place is allocated on the basis of an EHC plan. However, there will be children, very many children with special educational needs, who have not yet secured this plan, and so VAT will apply to them. We know families, I'm not at the moment, we know families have to go through a rigorous set of tests to obtain this plan, often ending in an appeal or taking many weeks to be finalised. In those cases, parents will have to make the difficult decision, what are they going to do with their child? Will they send them to an independent school because that plan has not been finalised? In these instances, there will now be a significant uplift in those pupils' fees, a massive worry for parents. Some will now no longer be able to afford those fees. And you can only imagine their guilt and concern. What are they going to do? Will they have to stop their child's progress at that school? Will they need to leave that school? How can it be fair that a child delayed in the education, health and care plan process through no fault of their own face VAT costs, where another child who's secured theirs in time does not have that burden? So, can the Minister also explain this unfairness they have now introduced into the system, and if they plan to put a stop to it, and a stop to it as soon as possible? And in the light of this unfairness, I would also urge the government to look at what steps can be taken to reduce the educational and health time care plan that the assessment takes, to reduce that time more generally. There are 3 local authorities in my constituencies, all of whom consistently go beyond the legal time frame. And so I asked Cheshire West Send Accountability Group for parents, how long is this EHC plan timescale? How long does it take? Some have waited over 60 weeks, whereas it should legally only take 20 weeks. And anecdotally, they say on average, it's taken 30 to 50 weeks. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Acknowledge to serve under your chairmanship today, and I want to congratulate the honourable member for Leeds East for securing this very, very important debate today. It has been widely noted that SEND provision came up significantly on the doorsteps during the general election, and the statement from the then Conservative Education Secretary earlier this year that SEND provision had reached a crisis point only further reinforced what we already knew. But it was under their watch. And no one wants to say, I told you so, Mr. Betts. But as the Shadow Minister who served on the Children and Families Bill, now Act, in 2014, that brought in education, health and care plans, I did, many times. This crisis is exactly what I, as the Shadow Minister, along with many from the education sector and the voluntary and the charities that supported me with many, many amendments, all said also that this was entirely predictable, the crisis that we are now in. It is a damning indictment that this is the state the Conservatives left SEND in, provision in, after 14 years in power. Between 2019 and 23, the number of AHCPs issued rose by 72%, but shockingly, dedicated SEND funding only rose by 42%. That's just one stat of many, many that I could give. The lack of funding, delays and deprioritisation of children with SEND is a stain on our society. And I know from challenges in my own family that I face that the impact on children's self-confidence and self-esteem and education that can be life-changing. I, like many here, will have first-hand experience of the impact that underfunded and disjointed SEND support can have, because my son Joseph is severely dyslexic, and his experience opened my eyes and gave me a lifelong passion for my whole 19 years as an MP to do something about the challenges that children with SEND experience in accessing support, but also to the variation to access quality of that support that children experience across the country. It really is a postcode lottery. He was eventually statemented age 10, so I won't go into his journey, but despite that, 2 decades on, children now currently entering the education system are having the same experiences that Joseph did. Nothing has improved. I've had many conversations with the BDA. Recently, I was chair of the all-party group, and it's one of the reasons that teachers struggle is lack of training. And Mr. Betts, due to time, I can't expand on that, but I'm sure others will. Thank you.
For securing such an important debate. Indeed, an Ofsted report for Hertfordshire deemed that there were widespread and systemic failings in the county, and they had not acted with the necessary urgency to address long-standing, systemic and significant weaknesses in the area of special educational needs and disability provision. This is reflected again and again with heartbreaking stories of families across Harpenden and Berkhamsted, let down by a broken system. One of my constituents, Charlotte, is a parent to 3 children, all with EHCPs and complex SEND needs. Being in a constant battle mode has become the norm for Charlotte and her family to secure educational support, and has resulted in her eldest child having to travel almost 100 miles a day to get to school. The emotional well-being of both Charlotte and her children has taken a toll, and her youngest child barely has attended school since October last year. Although progress is being made, there is still much more work to do. Not only have we been let down by Conservative-led Hertfordshire County, but also a flawed national funding formula inherited from the previous Conservative government. This formula means that children in Hertfordshire receive far less funding per head than neighbouring Buckinghamshire. Hertfordshire is the 3rd lowest funded authority per head for high needs funding and would receive £85 million more per annum if funded at the same rate as its neighbour.
Will the Honourable Lady give way?
I'll give way.
Thank you to the Honourable Lady for giving way. With only 3.6% of EHCPs in Conservative-led West Sussex County Council being delivered within the statutory 20-week framework, does the Honourable Member agree that funding, which is currently a postcode lottery, needs to be reviewed across the country?
Absolutely. The Honourable Lady took the words out of my mouth, I would say. And indeed, at the current rate, I'll come back to an Honourable Gentleman in a moment. At the current rate, in Hertfordshire, it would take 15 years to achieve parity between the 2 counties. This is a lost generation. So a 3-year-old in Hertfordshire today with SEND needs would have to finish all their formal education before they'd get equal funding with a similar child in Buckinghamshire. The formula has created a postcode lottery for pupils with special educational needs, and it is unacceptable. Most importantly, though, we should listen to the experience of local families to truly understand the human cost of the outdated formula. Unfortunately, stories such as Charlotte's are not isolated cases, as much of what will be shared today. That formula has left many families away from their local communities, away from their support networks, and into the minefield that is SEND provision. The funding formula must move with the times. It must be updated to reflect the present and increasing demand. And so I ask the Minister, when will the government change that funding formula to reflect the current need?
Thank you, Mr Betts, and thank you very much to my honourable friend, the member for Leeds East, for securing this important debate. We've heard from many members how dire the situation is in their constituencies, but can we for a second celebrate the incredible staff who already do provide so much of their efforts and their passion to put on provisions for children. My first visit as an MP was to Milford School in Ernesettle in Plymouth, which supports children and young adults with complex needs. And I have to pay tribute to the incredible staff there, congratulate Milford School for recently being rated as outstanding by Ofsted. I'm also pleased we are moving away from one-word Ofsted ratings because it's impossible to capture what Milford do for people in just one word. While visiting Milford, we stopped by their daily sing-along in the hall. Pupils from all age groups were having an incredible time, singing in various tunes and volumes and quite literally jumping for joy. It was a fantastic scene to see. But despite this, huge challenges remain. For example, at that school, the corridors are so narrow that you cannot even wheel 2 wheelchairs past each other. The situation in Plymouth is similar to many of the members here, but some of the statistics that we've heard don't match quite how dire it is. Because in Plymouth, 18.5% of pupils have got a SEND need, well above the national figure of 13%. The number of children and young people with an EHCP in Plymouth has increased since 2010 by 125%, more than doubled. But we know there is no quick fix for the crisis in SEND. Special educational needs are complex, they're wide-ranging, they require complex and wide-ranging solutions. We need to listen carefully to the educational professionals, the support staff, and especially those with lived experience of SEND as we move forward. I'm really proud that I ran for Parliament on a manifesto that pledged to take a community-wide approach to special education needs, improving inclusivity in mainstream schools, as well as ensuring special schools are fit. Yes.
Thank you very much. Like you in the Shipley constituency, the number of pupils with SEND is increased again this year, and it's putting a huge pressure on our teachers and teaching assistants in mainstream schools. And so will my right honourable friend agree with me that the cuts to school funding that we saw under the previous government have contributed to this problem? And will the honourable member agree that further steps need to be taken to ensure appropriate training for all of our school staff, particularly those in mainstream? Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her contribution, and I completely agree with your point about the cuts in funding. One of the things I was going to mention that I removed from my contribution because of the time constraints is to respond to a point from the Honourable Lady who asked earlier whether the government had conducted feasibility studies around the removal of VAT exemptions from private schools. And I would just respond to that by asking whether the former government, who we've had since 2010, conducted feasibility studies around SEND when they conducted deep cuts to education. Moving on, I started by speaking about the fantastic Milford Special School in Plymouth Moor View, my constituency. Expanding capacity at Milford is central to Plymouth City Council's plan to address the SEND crisis. But it's much harder to access funding to replace or rebuild a school than it is to build new schools. So will the Minister commit to working with me to help expand capacity at Plymouth Moor View's special schools?
Thank you to the Honourable Member for Leeds East for securing this debate. Before I start, I want to draw attention to my register of interest, as I'm still a South Gloucestershire councillor. Right across the country, children with special educational needs and disabilities are being let down, and parents are at their wits' end trying to navigate the system. The current SEND funding model is utterly broken, leaving local councils and schools unable to provide the learning environments our children need. There are three particular problems I want to highlight in this debate. The first relates to the safety valve agreements put in place to support local authorities who are struggling the most to deliver these important services. As I know, as the former leader of South Gloucestershire Council, the targets in those that were set pre-pandemic failed to reflect the massively rising demand we have faced since, meaning they are no longer fit for purpose. They need to be reviewed. So I look forward to hearing the Minister outline in their response what steps the government will take immediately to do this. The second issue I want to highlight is the punitive approach taken to school absence in this country. If a child's needs are not being met in school, it can lead to them being unable to attend. Parents who have been fighting hard to get their child the support they need can then face the added burden of the threats of fines or even imprisonment. Talk about adding insult to injury. Can you imagine the impact that has on parents who are already under huge stress, who may be under financial pressure due to employment being affected by their additional caring responsibilities, who may feel compelled to physically force their child into a situation that is harming them against all their parental instincts? And above all, think of the impact on the child, pressured to go into an inappropriate environment and worried that bad things may happen to their parents. Finally, I would like to highlight the increasing use of alternatives to exclusion, such as isolation and temporary moves to other schools, measures that are not recorded and published in the same way that exclusions are, and which are not subject to the same safeguards. A child that is struggling to learn in a classroom with a subject specialist teacher is highly unlikely to be able to do so when sat in a room with a supervisor and some worksheets. A neurodivergent child that thrives on routine will be distressed by such a change, especially if it involves a move to an unfamiliar school. And in some schools, the list of behaviour that is sanctioned this way could easily have been drawn from a diagnostic list for ADHD or autism. So if the children do not have appropriate support in place, it seems inevitable that they will be subject to these sanctions. There needs to be an urgent review of the use of such measures, which can easily go under the radar. So in conclusion, we need action now from the government to fix these problems before the House of Cards comes tumbling down, starting with fixing the funding formula and reviewing all existing safety valve agreements. Thank you.
To hear about their experiences operating within a broken system. I have to say that many of the stories I heard from these families Many of the stories I've heard on the doorstep and many of the stories I've heard here from members today are heartbreaking. Children stuck on assessment waiting lists for months longer than they should be. Parents having to juggle work around caring for kids that are off school or find themselves repeatedly excluded because their needs aren't being met. These same parents then being left struggling to pay the bills. Inadequate provision in mainstream education and far, far too few state-maintained special schools to meet demand. As the previous Conservative Education Secretary herself admitted, the system is lose, 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 and is desperately in need of reform. I will give way.
Would he agree with me that one of the very serious consequences of the issues he's outlining is the problem of non-elective home education, where parents feel forced to take their children out of school entirely because they just have no other option than to educate their child at home? And would he therefore welcome, as I do, the measures included in the proposed Children's Wellbeing Bill to require local authorities to set up and maintain children not in school registers so we can get a better sense of that problem?
Absolutely, and I was proud to highlight just that issue in my maiden speech as a new member to this place, the issue of ghost children who are missing out on education and who are too often falling off the radar. Absolutely, that's a really important part of the puzzle. This government has rightly placed education at the heart of its programme for change, with a national mission to break down the barriers of opportunity for all children. And for nobody is this more needed than for our SEND kids, who face significant barriers to inclusion. This is a question of social mobility. How can we ensure that no matter a child's needs or background, they can thrive at school and on into their adult lives? I could focus on many areas where improvement is desperately needed, but one issue raised time and again by the families I've spoken to in Bracknell and by other members here today, including honourable members for Gosport and Washington and Gateshead South, and that I've experienced in my previous career in education, is a lack of adequate training about SEND in schools, both in initial teacher training and as part of a teacher's continuing professional development. That's why I was proud to stand on a Labour manifesto that committed to introducing a new teacher training entitlement, to give teachers the time they need to learn the skills to help them better support SEND kids. As a teacher, time was always the most precious resource. I'd like to see this include more targeted support for SENCOs and input from SEND families at all stages. Now, let me be clear, there are many more areas where this broken system requires much needed reform, and we've heard so many fantastic contributions to that effect today. But if we're to ensure more SEND kids can be supported within the mainstream system, can attend school and not be shut out of education, and thereby reduce pressure on heavily oversubscribed special schools, would be one step closer to fixing the SEND system, one step closer to breaking down the barriers for all children.
Thank you very much, Mr. Betts. In Farnham Borden, which I proudly represent, we are fortunate to have many excellent special educational schools, such as the Ridgeway School, the Abbey School, Moore House, Undershaw School, and Stepping Stones in Surrey, and Hollywater in Hampshire. However, Surrey is a special case requiring urgent and increased government action. Nationally, SEND education affects around 18% of pupils, but in Surrey, this figure rises to a staggering 39%, double the national average. Hampshire largely aligns with the national figures, yet both counties face rising demands. Surrey's situation, however, highlights a need for immediate, targeted intervention from government. And while I remain equally committed to supporting SEND pupils and parents in Hampshire, Surrey's unique pressures cannot be ignored. These families need more support, not only from their local councils, but crucially from central government. The Conservative government made a significant strides in addressing these challenges. For over a decade, Conservative chancellors had increased annual funding to meet the rising demand. Since 2015, we've seen a 283% increase in EHCP agreements, I think demonstrating the government's responsiveness to that growing number of diagnoses. Yet despite this progress, there is so much more to be done, and the strain on services continues to grow. I've seen the profound impact that early detection and diagnosis can have, particularly in SEND, when identifying needs early is crucial to to a child's long-term success. And while local authorities like Surrey and Hampshire are doing their best, they need more resources to manage the increased demand without delays. And I'm deeply concerned, however, by the government's decision to raise VAT on independent SEND schools. This policy risks pushing many children who are not funded by local authorities, such as 40% of the children at Moor House, back into the state sector, which is already struggling with larger class sizes and fewer resources. A 20% increase in fees will be devastating for these families, particularly given the long waiting times for EHCPs. The government must rethink its VAT strategy on these schools. In my constituency, parents have shared with me their immense stress and frustration that they face, not just from navigating the system, but from the delays that impact their children's education and well-being. These families are already stretched, and the uncertainty is taking an untold toll on both themselves and their families. There is an urgent need for more trained educational psychologists and special educational needs coordinators, and the government must step up to provide those. It is also critical that MPs across all parties stop using SEND as a political football, as we have seen recently in Surrey. The blame game helps no one. It only serves to confuse and frustrate parents further. We must work together to provide clear, accurate information and focus on delivering the support that families in Surrey and Hampshire so desperately need. We need action now, and we need action quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Leeds East for securing this important debate. Support for children with special educational needs and disabilities is an issue that has been raised with me consistently since my election 3 years ago in both Batley and Spen and now my new Spen Valley constituency. I have had countless conversations and emails, held round tables and had meetings with families, head teachers, teaching assistants, counsellors and charities about the anger, frustration and in many cases deep trauma they have experienced trying to navigate the broken system which is SEND. All any of them want to do is get our children and young people the help and support they need and deserve. Because as our new Secretary of State for Education has said, every child should have the support they need and deserve. But instead, we have got amazing children and young people who are being prevented from being the very best that they can be, not enjoying their education, and instead struggling in school and falling behind, which often has a deeply detrimental impact on their mental health and well-being. And it's not just the children themselves. I've had parents in tears in my office feeling like they have failed as they haven't been able to get an EHCP for their child. They've given up work so that it can support them, meaning their own sense of identity and self-worth has suffered, and they feel guilty that they are not contributing to society and the economy. And I have had head teachers and staff in schools feeling like it's their fault that they can't ensure every child in their care gets the education they deserve. But the reality is they are so desperately under-resourced and the system is so broken, they simply cannot do their jobs in the way that they want. And it's not just schools. As a former college lecturer, I know there are challenges there too. And colleges are often a lifeline for students with SEND. But as the Association of College Lecturers say, there are real challenges in the way the SEND system fits together through funding and student transitions. This is just not right. So like with so many other issues, this new government is having to pick up the pieces of a broken system, which is the result of years of schools and local councils being chronically underfunded and under-resourced. The previous government did not give our education system the care and attention it needed. Ministers were just not listening to the sector and not providing the resources and funding they so desperately needed. I've been supporting parents and schools over the last 3 years. Laura at RIAC, a mum of 2, recently got in touch. Her children are both academically bright, but cannot cope with sensory overload and cannot be in mainstream school setting, which is noisy and bright. The parents are getting very little support to home educate the children, and the situation got so severe that one of the children has tried to commit suicide. After battling with the SEND system, they're only getting 6 hours support each week, and they should be getting 25. Many parents have contacted me about this issue. Children are losing vital education, and these stories show just how broken the current system is. So I am very pleased that this new government has already started to give SEND the care, compassion and understanding that is needed to address this crisis.
Sorry to disappoint so many people. It's pretty inevitable. Just to say for new members, I didn't call anyone who hadn't applied to speak in advance, and I tried to take account of the time when people applied in the order in which I called people. That's the only way we can do it, really. Moving on now to the front benches, 10 minutes each. If you could leave a little bit of time at the end for the mover to respond, that would be helpful. On to the Lib Dems, Mura Wilson.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Betts. And can I congratulate, pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Leeds East for securing this incredibly important debate. I think the fact that it's such a packed chamber with standing room only is testament to both the passion with which he set out the case and the stories we've heard. I mean, so many new members, those of us who've served 1, 2, 3 or more terms know that inboxes and postbags are bulging with stories and heartbreaking cases right across the country. In the time available and given the number of speakers, I'm not going to do the customary paying tribute to all the various speeches, but I may refer to various speakers as I go. But I would particularly like to recognise those new members who've come in who were formerly teachers. And it's so good to have more teachers in the House, and it's important that we hear your voice. And I'd like to thank the member for Plymouth Moorview for particularly paying tribute to the hard work of staff up and down the country who are having to battle in this system alongside parents and pupils. Look, as we've heard, too many vulnerable children who should be receiving crucial support to learn, play and thrive are being let down by a system that is broken. According to the latest government data, there are over 1.6 million children in England with a special educational need. That's almost 1 in 5 of our pupils. In the past few years, we've heard there's been a huge growth in the level of demand, with the number of pupils with an education, health and care plan growing by almost 12% in the past year alone. Over 500,000 children are now on EHCPs. And despite the best efforts and dedication of everyone involved in the sector, including teachers, parents and charities, it's clear that services are struggling to keep up with demand. And as a result, too many children with SEND are being left behind. The new government has an immense challenge on its hand. And for all its rhetoric, education was not a priority for the previous Conservative government once they were left to their own devices from 2015 onwards. I have no doubt that the Shadow Minister today will point to a plethora of announcements on SEND and promises to build special schools in response to the overwhelming and growing need. Action, sadly, never met the rhetoric. The evidence is crystal clear, as has been backed up by the stories we've heard right across the House today. We know that parents and children are stuck in an adversarial system, fighting as well as waiting many months, sometimes even years, to get the support their children are entitled to. The previous government's own SEND review in 2022 stated that the system was failing to deliver for children, young people and their families. And as we've heard, the former Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, even described it as lose, lose, lose. We also know that head teachers are at their wits' end, with teachers and teaching assistants being driven out of the classroom because of the strain on them. Last year, on a visit to Harrogate, my honourable friend, the member for Harrogate and Knaresborough, and I met the SENCO for Coppice Valley School, who was leaving because he just felt he could not meet the needs of his pupils and the support that they deserved. In my own constituency, I've heard about serious safeguarding incidents in schools involving children with SEND who aren't getting the support they desperately need and deserve. Not only is it unfair on those particular children, but it's unfair on the whole class, and it's unfair on the teaching staff who are doing their very, very best to provide a good education for all. With school budgets so stretched, I know that many schools are struggling to offer the inclusive education they want to. That many are laying off teaching assistants to deliver the cost savings they need. And it's often those teaching assistants that are providing the support for a child with special educational needs to remain in a mainstream classroom. At the same time, local authorities can't possibly plug the funding gaps from their own budgets, given the parlous state of council finances. I'll give way briefly.
I can commend her on the speech that she's given, and she rightly points out that the challenges around the laying off of teaching assistants. But does she agree with me that in all of the reforms that the government needs to look at, we really must not go back to a special schools approach, but we should always focus on having an inclusive education system with the right support for those children to learn alongside their peers?
I thank the honourable member for her intervention. I agree, where possible, we need to be as inclusive as possible. But equally, there are children whose needs cannot be met in a mainstream setting, and we need to have special provision. I was just going to touch on that in a moment. The funding for special needs has fallen so far short of what is needed that local authorities across the country now have a cumulative high needs deficit of approximately £3.15 billion. Many local authorities' financial viability is being put at risk by these growing deficits, And whilst the safety valve programme that my honourable friend from Thornbury and Yate mentioned, of which my own borough of Richmond-upon-Thames was an early member, has provided some relief, it's a sticking plaster solution, kicking the can down the road. Once those agreements run out, those local authorities are projected to start racking up big deficits again. Now, as well as providing the cost of providing the support that children are legally and morally entitled to, councils are also seeing their SEND transport bills skyrocket, as my honourable friend, the member for Harpenden and Berkhamsted, pointed out with the case from her constituency. We know that children having to make long journeys has increased by almost a quarter over the past 5 years. And the reason why vulnerable children are having to travel ever further distances is because specialist provision is just not available locally for many. 2/3 of all special schools are full or over capacity, and the last government was incredibly slow in building the schools, the special schools that they promised. And it turned down many applications from councils to build their own and open their own SEND schools to make that provision available. So councils are facing the double whammy of not only paying transportation costs, but also having to buy in private provision. Many independent SEND schools are brilliant not-for-profit charities, but we know that there is also obscene profiteering from some private equity firm-run special schools, and they are bleeding councils up and down the country dry. I hope the Labour government will look at this, because my calls to the previous Conservative government fell on deaf ears. Now, I do want to pick up a point that has been made by the Honourable Member for Tatton, which is that there are many families with children where children are not eligible for EHCPs or who can't face the gauntlet of trying to secure one. And they turn to mainstream small independent schools to better support their child, because the larger mainstream schools can't support that need. And yet these are the families that are going to be penalised by the new government's plan to slap VAT on independent school fees from January. For those who won't be able to afford the additional cost, they'll be turning to the state sector, putting more pressure on, as we've heard, a system in crisis. Furthermore, the proposal to have a VAT exemption for those with EHCPs will incentivise even more parents to apply through the system, and I've heard from a constituent just this week who's probably going to have to do that, which will put yet more pressure in a system that cannot cope with more. I'm looking forward to hearing what the Minister has to say for those 100,000 children who have SEND, who are in the independent sector. Now, all of us recognise that SEND provision is an enormous challenge that's not going to be resolved overnight, despite what the Secretary of State hopes to be able to do. And I stand ready to support her in any way I can to make sure that we do tackle this issue. Liberal Democrats in our recent manifesto set out several ideas, and I hope the Minister will look at them. Firstly, we've proposed that a new national body should be established for SEND, and this would be responsible for funding the support of children with very high needs. This national body for SEND would pay for any costs above £25,000 for children with high needs, and it reduces risk for local authorities and helps tackle the postcode lottery that we've heard about. I'm not sure I've got the time. I'm so sorry. The national body for SEND would also act as a champion for every child with special needs or disabilities and promote widespread inclusive practice. Additionally, Liberal Democrats would like to see councils funded to reduce the amount that schools pay towards the cost of a child's education, health and care plan. The current £6,000 threshold acts as a disincentive in the system, which can hinder schools from identifying and establishing a need before it impacts the child's schooling. We can't wait for things to go wrong before we fix them. And as the Honourable Member for Gosport said, early intervention is key. That's why boosting training for teachers, as we've heard from many Labour members, and for early years, training for early years practitioners so that we can identify needs early and support early is so, so crucial. Mr. Betts, in conclusion, behind every statistics and case study, behind every statistics and case study used by members in the House today, there is a child who's struggling with parents and carers who are under stress. We have a duty collectively here to act. Liberal Democrats believe every child, no matter their needs and their background, deserves the opportunity to thrive. I look forward to hearing the Minister's comments and working with the Education Secretary to fix our broken SEND system. The children deserve it.
James Wild.
Thank you very much, Mr. Betts. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Leeds East for securing this debate and for such a popular debate. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to respond on behalf of the opposition. I think the number of members who've spoken in this debate, and I think it's the third debate in this chamber this week, and I think the Minister's got a season ticket, just underlines the amount of casework that we all have to deal with, I dealt with in the last Parliament, to help parents and children to get the support that they need. And that's exactly what this debate is about. And we all want an education system that helps children and young people with SEND to fulfil their potential and live fulfilling lives. And I pay tribute to all those working in schools, including my sister, who is a Senko in a Norfolk school, to support those children. And we've heard from everyone who's spoken today about the demand and the challenges that that's causing and the pressure on funding. And we've seen the number of EHCPs and statements of SEN have more than doubled since 2015. In my own county of Norfolk, there's been a 33% increase in the last 5 years alone. And my honourable friend for Farnham and Borden referred to the pressures, the real pressures that particularly are occurring in Surrey. And it was in recognition of this growing demand that the last Conservative government increased the high needs budget by to £10.5 billion this year, 60% higher than it was in 2020. And to help increase much needed capacity, £2.6 billion was invested to fund new places and to improve existing provision. Nonetheless, as everyone has heard today, the level of demand continues to grow. And it's the need for more consistent support and outcomes that led to the SEND and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan that was published last year. This review came after a long period of discussion with the sector, with parents, with schools to understand what was needed, and it aimed to ensure that every child gets the right support in the right place at the right time. And at its core was the attempt to deal with the feeling that too many parents have that they have to battle a system, which every MP in this room knows about, and the Honourable Member for Portsmouth North talked about the challenges that there are in terms of getting the EHCPs done in time, and she had a suggestion about how that could potentially be addressed. I will give way.
For giving way. Under the previous government, in 2023, 98% of the appeals to tribunal were upheld. Doesn't that demonstrate the utter failure under the watch of the previous government that's created this broken SEND system?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes his point. I think it underlines the need for reform of the system, which is precisely why mediation was going to be part of the proposals that we brought forward. And these reforms were based around national standards, so there was a consistent approach. And the first area that was going to be brought forward was developing standards for speech and language, which is so important, and to improve the timeliness of the HCP process by introducing a standardised approach. But as part of our focus on SEND, the last government did open 15 new free schools, approved a further 40, and invested in training, again so important, for over 5,000 early years SEND practitioners. But I know the Minister is committed to delivering better outcomes, so can she confirm whether the government is committed to implementing the national standards and that approach that we put forward in those reforms? And the funding in the SEND sector remains a significant challenge, increasing pressure on councils. The recent County Council Network and LGA reports set this out very clearly, and of course in government we set out the safety valve and delivering better value programmes, which other members have referred to, and 90 local authorities are involved in. Additionally, the statutory override was introduced to prevent SEND-related deficits from overwhelming council budgets. However, that override is set to expire in March 2026. And without clear direction, local authorities face the prospect of making significant cuts. So can the Minister clarify what the government's intentions are here, and if the statutory override will be extended to give councils the flexibility to work with schools and families to make the changes that are needed? Local authorities are also seeing huge pressures from home to school transport costs. In Norfolk alone, that's £60 million, with 83% of that allocated to SEND pupils, money that's spent on journeys rather than delivering better education. So improving the mainstream education and the specialist provision closer to where children live is, of course, vital. And one of my first visits of over 40 that I've undertaken in my first term as an MP in my constituency was to Green Park Academy, where the head raised the issue, which has been referred to, of speech and language therapy and access to therapists. And during the Conservative government, we did make progress in improving access, recognising the long-term benefits of early intervention. But there is still much more to do, and I readily concede that. So I welcome the announcement the government made in July that it will continue the Nuffield Early Language Intervention Programme this school year, and I hope that it will continue beyond that. However, there is still considerable disparity in access, so I asked the Minister what steps the government will take to address this so that every child with speech and language needs gets the support that they deserve. I will give way.
Would my honourable friend agree with me that it's a travesty that a child with SEND in the London Borough of Camden receives more than 3 times the funding of a child with SEND in my constituency of Bridlington and the Wolds, and that every child should have the access to the same support, funding and opportunity?
Absolutely. My honourable friend makes the point that our right honourable friend for Holton Price and Howland made earlier and made in a previous debate in the last Parliament as well, and I'm sure it's something that the Minister will touch on in her response. I will.
The point that you made around the safety valve, the LGA and the CCN have assessed that it's around £3 billion that safety valve is worth. Had the party opposite stayed in power, what would their solution be to fill that black hole?
Well, as the honourable gentleman will be aware from his presence in the chamber, we did not win the election, so that is for the government to come forward as to what it will do, because it is now in power and has to take decisions and has to take responsibility. It's the difference between opposition and government. Finally, I do have to highlight the impact of the Labour government's plans to impose VAT on independent schools from January and what this will mean for SEND provision. Over 100,000 children and young people without an EHCP are educated and receive specialist support in independent schools. And my right honourable friend for Tatton made this point very well and highlighted that putting VAT on their fees will disrupt the education for thousands of these pupils and also place further strain on SEND provision in the state sector. And by bringing these changes in partway through the academic year, Labour's plans seem designed to cause maximum disruption to those children's learnings and to the state school system. So is the government listening to schools, to parents, and will it act to ensure that these vulnerable children do not bear the brunt of this policy? I will give way.
He's talking about disruption to children and their development. Under the last government, in the last 10 years, investment in early intervention such as children's centres fell by about 44%. What effect did you think that had on young children?
Well, I think we need to look at these things in a round. We put record amounts into childcare, and we've just seen the latest rollout of our childcare plans, which I think the government now supports, although a little sotto voce. Anyway, to conclude and bring this debate so the Minister had time to respond, I think there's unity across this chamber, I hope, about the desire to ensure that the SEND system provides the support and outcomes that children and young people deserve. And to help achieve that, the last government did set out a path of comprehensive reform. And now it falls to the new government to continue to drive improvements and to tackle the challenges set out in this debate by members from all parties and to deliver the very best for children and their families.
It's an honour to serve under you as Chair, Mr Betts, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Leeds East on securing a debate on this incredibly important subject, and how well attended it is shows how important it is. And I pay tribute to all honourable members who have managed to make their contributions to today's debate to make sure that their constituents' voices are heard. And I would like to be able to respond to all of the points that you've raised individually, but the sheer volume of you will make that challenging. But I also want to pay tribute to those of you who have come today, who have prepared speeches and have not been able to deliver them. I know that the voices of your constituents want to be heard in this debate as well, and I pay tribute to the effort that you've put in being here as well and showing that level of support. The strength of feeling on this issue is, give me one moment, is really clear, and I want to reassure you, most of all, that this government is absolutely committed to tackling this. It is absolutely key to breaking down the barriers to opportunity, to give every child the best start in life, and that includes all of those with special educational needs and disabilities, to give them the right start in life to have a successful education and to lead happy, healthy and productive lives. I'll warn, I will not be able to take many interventions, but I will take one. You got in so fast.
My
constituent Hayley wrote on my social media that after years of being unheard or ignored, I feel a small sense of relief that this is now being taken to Parliament and discussed, even though I understand there is a long way to go. Can I thank the Minister for her speech, and can I share with her another time the testimonies of the many constituents who have contacted me ahead of this debate?
Yes, I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention. I think she speaks for many of you who are here today and those watching this debate as well. We are listening, we are committed, we want to work across the sector and with all of you in order to turn this around. Over 1.6 million children and young people in England have special educational needs, and we know that for far too long, too many families have been let down by a system that is not working. As mentioned already, the former Secretary of State for Education described the system as lose, 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 and I know there is agreement in this room that that is very much the case. I will give way.
I thank Honourable Fan for giving way. She's been very generous with her time. Would she agree with me that part of the serious problems that many of us in our local areas face was the delay in building new SEND provision under the previous government? This certainly had a very serious effect in Berkshire. There are huge pressures on families and vulnerable children in my area, and I just wanted to relay that point again to her.
I appreciate the honourable gentleman's concern, and this government is absolutely committed to strengthening children's entitlement to excellent provision that meets their needs, that is readily available and locally wherever possible. And that is a key focus of any changes that we wish to see made in this area. Because despite... I will. Last one.
Thank the Minister for giving way. And it's an issue that's not been raised enough today. The previous government sent an alternative provision plan, published just last year, contained absolutely no specific proposals for rural communities like mine. Can she confirm that the Labour government will consider the specific needs, particularly around access for SEND pupils in rural areas?
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate the issue that the Honourable Lady is raising, and I will come on to that because I appreciate there have been a lot of comments from members today on the national funding formula and how it works. I will come to that, and I would like to make some progress. So if honourable members would allow me to, there are a number of issues that I would like to respond to, particularly in relation to the honourable gentleman who tabled this debate. Despite high needs funding for children and young people with complex special educational needs and disabilities rising to higher and higher levels, confidence in the system is low, tribunal rates are increasing, and there are increasingly long waits for support. Far too many children with special educational needs fall behind their peers. They do not reach the expected level in fundamental reading, writing and math skills. Just 1 in 4 pupils achieving expected standards at the end of primary school. That is a system that is lose, 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 as the former Education Secretary of Education described. Families are struggling to get their child the support they need and, more importantly, deserve. And so many of you have spoken on behalf of families that you represent and demonstrated that today. After years in which parents have been frustrated by reform programmes being delayed, by promises not being delivered, this Labour government wants to be honest with families, and we are absolutely committed to improving inclusivity and expertise in mainstream schools, as well as ensuring special schools can cater to those with the most complex needs. We want to restore parents' trust that their child will get the support that they need to flourish. And we know that early identification and intervention is really key to ensuring that the impact of any special educational need or disability is minimised, to reduce that impact for the long term. And that's why we very quickly announced the continuation of funding for the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, the NELLI programme, to make sure that that can continue for year 24 to 25, because we know that that early speech and language intervention will help these children and young people find their voice. But we also know there are no quick fixes for these very deep-rooted issues. After 14 years, I can scarcely see a system that is as broken, one in such desperate need of reform, and that is why we are absolutely determined to fix it, and we have started work already. It is a priority for this department to fix our SEND system. but we know we cannot do it alone. We have to work with the sector, we have to work with valued partners, we have to make sure our approach is fully planned and delivered together with parents, with schools, with councils, with expert staff, who we know are already going above and beyond for our children, but we can do so much better. Many members, as I mentioned, have raised concerns about the national funding formula, and so we acted as quickly as we could to respond to some of the immediate cost pressures in the SEND system. We know it's causing incredible financial difficulties in some local authorities. So before the parliamentary recess, we announced a new core schools budget grant to provide special and alternative provision schools with over £140 million of extra funding in this financial year, to help with the extra costs of the teacher pay award and the outcome for the increased negotiations for support staff as well. And this is in addition to the high needs funding allocation for children and young people with complex special needs and disabilities. However, despite these record levels of investment, I know families are still fighting the system because it is not delivering. The Department for Education budget for 25-26 hasn't yet been decided, and how much high needs funding is distributed to local authorities, schools and colleges next year will depend on the next stage of the government spending review. It is due to be announced in October. It does mean that the high needs allocations have not been published in the normal timescale, but we are working at pace to announce next year's funding allocations, and we are acutely aware of the pressures that local authorities are facing, not only because they are supporting these increasing needs of young people and children, but also the financial pressures that the government as a whole is facing because of the economic climate that we have inherited. So it's not going to be easy or quick to solve these problems, but we really want to work on long-term solutions, and we want to work together on these important issues. So, and that includes looking at the national funding formula. We will take time to consider whether to make changes to the formula, and of course we'll consider the impact on any local authorities and as she mentioned, on particular areas that have made representations in relation to it. On inspection, I really am short of time. On inspection, we welcome the publication of the Big Listen response this week. We want to work with Ofsted to consider how outcomes for children with SEND can better demonstrate inclusion, and we want every school to be driving for their school to be as inclusive as it can be, and that mainstream provision is provided for as many children as possible. In the interest of fairness, I will give way just one time.
Thank you, Minister, for briefly giving way, and I thank her for her comments on reviewing the funding formula. Can I just take this opportunity to really urge her to finally address the per-pupil funding deficit of pupils in Cornwall who receive thousands and thousands of pounds per pupil less than pupils in the rest of the country. And I hope she agrees with me that pupils in Cornwall and my constituency of North Cornwall, particularly those with special educational needs, aren't less valuable than children in other parts of the country.
Yeah, I will say again and again that we are absolutely committed to ensuring that every child's entitlement to have the best education possible in their local area and where they need it can be delivered under our system. But nothing says more about the state of our nation than the well-being of our children. And one of the great casualties of the last 14 years has been our children's well-being, their development and their opportunities. Under the last governments, we saw relative child poverty soar, rates of children presenting with mental health conditions skyrocketing, more and more children languishing on waiting lists. And it now falls to the Labour government to rebuild opportunities for our children. And that's why we do have bold ambitions. We are determined to deliver. And I want to thank honourable members for bringing this matter forward today, for all of you who have contributed to today's debate. But most of all, I want to acknowledge the hard work being done by so many working in education, in health and care, who support our children and young people with special educational needs. We know it's challenging, but we thank them for their commitment and their service.
Very briefly, Richard Bergen to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Betts, and thank you to all honourable members who have taken part today. And I hope that particularly new members where demand has exceeded supply today will consider publishing online their speeches if they'd written them in advance if they weren't able to make them. I'd like to thank the Minister for her response, her statement of intent. This can only be the beginning. We need to recognise there is a crisis in SEND. We need to ensure that it is properly financed, properly funded. We need to ensure it's not seen in a silo, but there's a holistic approach, and we need to move forward. And I hope that in the full chamber we can find more time to take this debate forward and tackle this challenge.
Right. The question is that this House has considered some provision. Many of those in opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding